Welcome back to the next video in our series. We're going to be diving into commandments 6 and 7. Do not commit adultery and do not steal. When it comes to the sixth commandment, do not commit adultery, I think that it's probably one of the most difficult commandments for us to speak about in today's culture because of the way that sex and relationships are and aren't talked about within the church as a whole, as well as the way that sex and relationships are depicted in our society. The Jewish and Christian faith traditions both teach that when it comes to sex, the God-given rule of thumb is that we are to be celibate in our singleness and faithful in marriage. And notice how there's a difference there between the way we talk about singleness in the church and singleness in our culture. From our faith-based perspective, that the opposite of single isn't dating, it's married. Dating couples have always been considered part of that single category because of the intimate and sacred relationship that comes in marriage. Facebook may let you mark yourself in a relationship, and we celebrate when two people come together and find one another and begin dating, absolutely. But when it comes to sexual intimacy, the Jewish and Christian faiths teach that the distinction is either single or married. So celibacy means that in our singleness, we don't engage in any kind of sexual intimacy. You may have heard the word abstinence before. Sex is best reserved, so we understand from God, for married couples. And as for those who are married, it's expected that couples be faithful to one another, both in their physical intimacy as well as their emotional intimacy. To begin with, it's enough for us to say that as Christians, the church teaching is that sex is best reserved for those who are married. In Scripture, there are a few examples of how people like Abraham, Jacob, King David, King Solomon had more than one spouse. And while there are those examples, these relationships are the exception to the rule. For the majority of people, marriage was monogamous, right, consisting of two partners. And over the course of time, the synagogues and the church began to teach that monogamous relationships are the standard of a faithful marriage. Which then brings us to adultery. Adultery means, in one of its simplest definitions, sex with anyone who is not your spouse. And so wrapped up in the commandment, do not commit adultery, is the instruction that in our singleness, we are celibate because we don't have a spouse. And in marriage, we are faithful to that one spouse. Look through your small catechism and find Luther's explanation to this commandment. He says that it means that we should fear and love God so that we may lead a chaste and pure life in words and in deeds, and each person love and honor their spouse. Chastity, living a chaste life, in its modern use, is normally used interchangeably with the word celibate. But the word chastity itself means restrained or simple. And what Luther intends to say in this is that we don't make sex the sum of our relationship with other people, right? It's not all about that. In the same way that our relationships with other people aren't totally based on money or power. To live a chaste and pure life in words and deeds is to caution us about looking at or treating other people purely as objects of our sexual desire. And now all of this isn't to say that sex is a bad thing, right? Sex is the way that God made us to participate in God's first work of creation. For married couples, sex is one of the most profound ways that two people can express their love and affection for one another. But it is to say the way that we use and view and treat sex in our relationships with other people can be harmful to ourselves or to others. And so this commandment is all about how we honor and respect people. God created us to be persons in community, in fellowship, and in love with one another. Remember back in Genesis when God made Adam. He said, "It's not good that this one should be alone. I will make him a companion, a helper, someone to walk and live alongside of him." And after making all of the birds of the air and the creatures of the field, not finding a suitable partner, God made Eve. To which Adam shouted with joy, "At last, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." We're made for one another. We also look and we remember that Jesus' first miracle was performed at a wedding. The relationship between husband and wife is important to God and should be celebrated, which is why it's important to focus on the way that we treat one another in the closest of our lifelong relationships. To live a chaste and pure life in word and in deed includes but goes beyond sexual purity and morality to all of our conduct. Do we treat other women and men with dignity, or do we think of them only in terms of how attractive they are or what they can provide for us? Do we look at other people as persons who are created and loved by God and worthy of our care and our support and our love? Think of the commercials you see on TV, the movies you watch, even the articles or ads that pop up in your social media feed. I would be willing to bet that the majority of them use attractive men or women to highlight their product or seduce the main character in the story or captivate your attention. And again, it's not a bad thing to appreciate another person's beauty, right? We are sexual beings. But what's happening in those media forms is a person is being sexualized to the point that that's all that we're meant to see. That person as an object, not as a person. Not as the person that God made them to be in Jesus. And that's why, in particular, the pornography industry is so dangerous, right? Not only are these people being exploited, but in many cases they are also victims of drug abuse, of kidnapping and human trafficking, and a whole host of other horrible things, all for the sake of allowing other people to objectify their neighbor and their bodies. Even before technology, the Israelites were no stranger to this kind of shame and abuse. In the Egyptian culture, it was common for Egyptians to have sexual relationships with people outside of the bonds of marriage, many times as a form of rape or abuse. The Egyptians would also sexually mistreat the Israelite slaves. This commandment from God helps the Israelites, as well as us, to remember that we are to look at other people with dignity and respect and to honor the relationships that are forged by God in marriage. Unfortunately, adultery in the form of sexual or verbal or emotional or physical unfaithfulness does happen, which leaves couples in relationships with one another hurt, betrayed, and often left with no other alternative than to break off the relationship or seek a divorce. When that happens, we are saddened, not because of the divorce itself, but because the relationship, the fellowship, and the community that God created us to participate in has been abused. Remember, Jesus said that the greatest commandment is to love God with everything that we are, and the second, like it, is to love our neighbor as ourselves. We are made for love. And adultery, like killing, or any of these other commandments, aren't that full expression of love that comes from God. And so keeping our sexual activity within the marital relationship is an important part of honoring and respecting our neighbor, because it helps us to respect them for who they are as a whole, not just for their bodies or their attractiveness. Sexual intimacy is best reserved for the bonds of marriage because there's a level of trust and vulnerability and self-giving that comes with it. Those things are precious and should only be shared with those whom we have a deep, long-standing commitment with, because our bodies and our relationships with other people are sacred. The common focus of not committing adultery, of each one loving and honoring wife or husband, recognizes that within a marital relationship, two people really are expected to become one flesh. They're expected to share everything in life together. And so committing adultery goes beyond cheating or being unfaithful. Dishonoring one's spouse or one's neighbor in any way is adultery, because the relationship blessed by God has been fractured. Abuse, neglect, mistreating one another takes away from the dignity of the other person, treating them as less than human, which is why the commandment to not kill and the commandment to not commit adultery go side by side. And so with that, I invite you to take some time, pause, talk about what you've heard and how you view God living in and through ourselves and our relationships with other people in this way. And when you're done, feel free to come back for commandment number 7. Moving on to the 7th commandment, do not steal. We remember that in Egypt, the Israelites were not allowed to own any property. They were poor, and anything that they had or that they found could be taken without question. And this caused the Israelites to become greedy, hoarding up extra food, hiding away water or tools that could have made life easier for others. They became jealous and would harm their Israelite neighbors out of greed, all in order to survive. Not stealing is about not placing our trust or our desire into material things. It's about not letting our greed get the better of us and ruin our relationships with the people that we may steal from. But then the question comes up, well, what about people who are hungry or have no money or means to provide food or basic needs for their family? If they don't steal, they don't eat. And doesn't that go against the life that God does want us to have? When Luther goes to explain this commandment, he says we should fear and love God that we may not take our neighbor's money or property, nor gain them by false wear or dealing, but help to improve and protect their property and business, that their means, their way of providing for themselves, are preserved, and their condition, their state of life, their quality of life is improved. So of course, don't go out and rob your neighbor, but also don't lie to them. Don't hold back all the truth from them so that they may owe us later on down the line. For the person stealing food to provide for their needs, we need to understand that stealing is stealing and it's wrong. But more than that, it's a larger problem that we as a people have created a world and buy into a society that makes it where people are forced into that situation, where they feel forced to steal just to survive. Stealing isn't just about not taking things that don't belong to us. It's about not hoarding up so much that others have nothing for themselves. It's wrong that people are left to fend for themselves alone so that they have to resort to that kind of action and behavior. Not stealing is about fairness and making sure that we and our neighbor enjoy the best quality of life possible together. Luther also says that we should help our neighbor to improve and protect our neighbor's income as well as their property. If you were to see someone snooping around your neighbor's backyard, do you call the police or do you ignore it? Wouldn't we hope that someone would help us to keep our property? Not only are we not to take advantage of our neighbor, but we're called to help them to grow and to improve, to help them make better for themselves so that they can live a comfortable, secure life. And the goal is that if everyone approached life in this way, if we helped our neighbor do the best that they can in the job that they have, if we help a coworker or a friend learn a new skill or do something that will help them improve what their life is like, if we do that, and we all do that for one another, we'll be surrounding ourselves with people who are surrounding and supporting us to do the same thing. We're not just constantly giving and giving and giving, but we're actually sharing in life together by treating people with honor and with dignity, with care, with respect. That kind of behavior would become contagious. And everyone would not only follow these commandments, but live a better, fuller, more joyful life because of them. Will you pray with me? God, we ask that you help us to use these commandments, that we may love our neighbors as we love ourselves, and in doing so, love you even more. Amen.